So please welcome our speakers for this panel discussion. They'll introduce themselves and are here to spark an interactive discussion with our audience. We have Ted Palashis, President and founder of Overbrook Support Services, Emily Kirkham, who is the President at National Laboratory Services, Inc., Jonathan Eisenberg, the Associate Principal of Arup, and Greg York, who is the Assistant Director, Lab of Facility Operations for Photis Therapeutics. Everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm going to invite you to give a little bit of your background, and then we'll jump into the audience questions.
Thank you, Mary Beth. My name is Ted Palashis. I've been president of Overbrook Support Services, a lab asset support specialization company for the last 23 years. And we support laboratories through their life cycle, specifically focusing on their instrumentation and assets.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Kirkham, and my company, National Laboratory Services, we work with labs across all various aspects of industry. I'm based in Canada, but we work with labs all across North and South America, just assisting with any part of the process from starting a startup right to method validation, instrument acquisition, compliance, any kind of aspect of laboratory assistance.
Hi, everyone. I'm John Eisenberg. I'm a principal at Arup, based in the Boston office. I've been practicing chemical engineering and fire engineering for about 37 years almost, and been with Arup about 10 years or so. I lead Arup's America's East geography science business and specialize in process hazards and compliance and risk management.
Hey everybody, I'm Greg York. I have been in the facilities and lab operations field in life sciences for the past roughly 10 years, based in the Boston area. I started out at a really small startup and grew to a company of roughly 300 before being acquired by a big pharma company. And now I'm back at another small startup, kind of hoping to replicate some of the success of the first company. But I have experience in all sizes of biotech companies, from a startup of 20 through to roughly 300, and then again, the big pharma experience too. So hoping to be able to share some insight and help hopefully everybody in the audience make some decisions about their lab asset management.
We have a few questions already, so let's jump right into the first one. It says, I am considering hiring an in-house resource to take on the management of our assets versus outsourcing. What should I be considering to make the right decision?
Greg, that's probably best directed to you.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a loaded question. I think it's probably one we could spend the majority of the time here talking about. But I think the biggest things to consider, at least from my experience, are the size of your company and budget. I think it's always the case. I think the point of this discussion is the surface hidden and unplanned costs. So I think I'm going to keep an eye towards the budget side. In my experience, it all depends on the size of your company, the number of assets that you have, and then the amount of time you have as well. I think for a lot of startup companies, it always ends up asset management sometimes can fall to lab personnel and scientists until they become big enough to hire an operations person, and that becomes part of their job. And then I think it can go full swing to the other side where you're a large company, and sometimes you need a person just to manage the outsourced vendor, right? I think when considering in-house versus an outsource, I think in-house is going to be dependent on where you are now, what your projected growth is, the number of assets you're managing. In my experience now, it's something that I'm managing in-house, and it's just a small fraction of what I'm managing. But as everybody knows, in life sciences, you can really quickly go from a 30-person company to a 100-person company, and you really have to be able to pivot quickly to make sure that you're making sure that your lab assets are getting the attention that they need, because it's such a crucial part of keeping the ship running. So I think how many instruments are you managing? Or is there any specialty equipment that would require specialized vendors anyways? What type of PM and calibration schedule do you have currently? What type of PM and calibration schedule do you have planned in the future? I think what can quickly happen, and as everybody on the call works in operations know, it's feast or famine sometimes. It might be days or weeks where it's status quo and then the ship's just running smoothly. And then all of a sudden, on the same week that you were going to have pipette calibrations done, all of a sudden your vacuum pump goes down and your biggest piece of equipment is having an issue. And it feels like you're drinking from the fire hose. Time is something that's really important to keep in mind, not only just kind of day to day, but also when you do have those kind of either emergency situations or situations where multiple things pop up at once. Those are situations where it's really nice to have an outsourced service that you can rely on them and put the burden on them to do some of the heavy lifting for you. But again, a lot of it's going to come down to what can we afford? What's our budget? What do we need to manage? Is it something that we already have somebody in-house that can take on the majority of the responsibility and we're just relying on an outsourced company for 5 to 10 hours a week? Is it something that we're going to bring on an outsourced company entirely and look at what that cost is? So yeah, I think that's the high level, what goes through my head when figuring out if we're going to do something in-house versus outsourced. I will say, I think it's really hard to, especially when you get to a size where you're having, instead of tens or you have hundreds of pieces of instrumentation that you need preventative maintenance and corrective maintenance on. Even as a full-time job, you're going to run into days or weeks where you just don't have enough hours in the day to be chasing everything and tracking everything down on top of it. So I think it's a natural progression for a lot of companies to have kind of someone doing it part-time, and then you hit a point where you have to make that decision where it's too much work for that person to be doing as part of their job, and you have to figure out, is it somebody we bring somebody on full-time for, or do we reach out to a company? And I think there's pros and cons of both. In my experience, I think the biggest pros of reaching out to an outsourced company is just their expertise and the amount of time that it's going to save not only you as the person that would be managing the vendor, but also your lab personnel as well, and just makes a little bit more of an efficient process. But again, it's going to depend on every company's individual status and what they need.
And Greg, just a question based on what you had just mentioned. How sophisticated should because there's a lot of different factors involved, right? How sophisticated should that, and maybe Emily, you can speak to this too as well. How sophisticated should that decision-making process be, right? Because you've got the amount of instruments that you've got, so your asset base. There's at least from our experience, you've got a whole organizational component to this because you've got vendors, you've got the instruments, you've got the scientists involved, you've got the specific assays that need to be run with downtime tolerances that are in some cases very tight. What's the driving decision-making process or decisions that what triggers and say, okay, I'm up to 100 assets, or does it have to do with the type of assets that you have? And I don't know, Emily, maybe can you speak to that from your experience?
Maybe on the flip side of things, I was just going to make a comment about like a startup and very small businesses, because it can seem almost obvious when you're getting into a really big situation. You have multiple vendors that you have to deal with, and the bandwidth of your subject matter experts just limits everything. And you start to lose money because you're not getting things done at the appropriate times. Maybe you're not retiring instruments when they need to be retired, and they're getting services they don't need. But on the small side, we do this quite a bit in my company, where we work with startups, assisting them with the instrument acquisition and deciding about what they're going to need based on the industry that they're moving into or the methods that they're bringing on board, and just making those decisions up front. It can really be cost saving in the long run. Because once you start down a certain path, the cost will multiply. And then when you have to back up and try to do things again, and if you're directed in the right way from the start, that can really save you a lot of money in the long run. It's a hard decision. I think it's a really hard decision for startups and for small businesses, because they look at this like cost. It's like an extra cost that they have to pay, and they have to think about, this is going to save me money in the long run. But we've seen it time and time again, especially if you're dealing with a place that's moving from a non-compliant to a compliant environment. That's a very typical case where if they don't invest up front in getting the right information to get the right systems in place, it really can end up costing them a lot in the long run. So I guess I'm looking at it more from that perspective, and maybe Greg can talk a little bit more about what size do you really make that choice and you really make that switch.
I think the biggest factor from my perspective is time. It's how much time does the person who's currently managing those assets have, and then how much time will they have if you add 10 pieces of equipment, if you double your size, if you triple your size, right? So I think for me, I like to have the conversation really early with invested parties, right? So you definitely always want to loop in someone from the finance side because, as I said, budget's super important. I think you also have to have a good relationship with your lab personnel and the science team so that you can have an understanding of what the company's doing and where they're going, right? If all of a sudden you go from having one UPLC and all of a sudden something happens and you're pivoting and all of a sudden you're going to need to acquire 2, 3, 4 more of those, right? That's going to be a more time-consuming asset to manage than something like a benchtop centrifuge would be, right? So I think it's important to look at what equipment you have, what type of equipment you have, and really have a sense and a pulse of where the science is leading to or what direction that's going.
If I may, so there's two things that you said. So one is the time factor involved, and we've had numerous conversations over the course of how many years.
Yeah.
And also to Emily's point, so first of all, there's an integration of the business and the science plan, right? So they have to be aligned, for one. Two, there's a diversionary cost involved. And what we have found as the size of the laboratory or the number of assets increase or the size of the laboratory increases, a lot of these tasks that may have traditionally been under the purview of the scientists now evolves into the lab operations side. And so I had a question, and I asked a client of ours once, who's a lab director, and I said, is it fair? Because at one point we were trying to monetize the return on investment and having outsourced management. I said, is it fair to say for every dollar that scientist or that lab operator, mostly scientists, is spending on asset management, is it a 1-to-1 ratio? And he responded, of course not. Is it less? He says, no, nobody hires anybody to break even. There's a factor, a ratio of at least 3 to 5. So in other words, for every hour that scientist is spending on needle seats and valve cartridges or figuring out following up on vendors and if they're going to show up and PM schedules, there's an expected return on that investment of that person's time, of that lab manager's time, or that scientist's time. So that's one of the hidden costs that I think rarely is understood. And when you brought up compliancy, Emily, I wanted to bring Jonathan in on this conversation because that's a huge hidden cost. We've seen that through our engagements in the projects that we've been involved with. And John, can you maybe speak to that a little bit about going from a non-compliant to a compliant environment or an expansion into a new space? What have you seen, or what are the things that you feel? What are the landmines that one should avoid as you walk through that process?
Thanks, Ted. Yeah, we're seeing a trend in our work towards a more regulated and more emphasis on compliance. And that not only goes for the design process in submitting a design for building permit, but even more so on the operations side of laboratories, where jurisdictions like Boston and Watertown and now Newton in Eastern Massachusetts and in other locations as well in different regions of the US, there's, I think, even more emphasis being placed on the operational sections of the codes like NFPA 45, for example. And so there are units of the regulatory agencies, whether it be the fire department, usually building department to some degree, health department in some cases for the biohazards, who are getting much more involved in registering laboratories to the applicable codes. And so you might do your project and you're getting ready for certificate of occupancy and startup, but you have to go through this last hurdle, which is this lab registration hurdle. That's a separate thing now. And additionally, as a tenant in the building, you likely will have to go through some hazardous material storage permitting as well, and some process permitting. Like I mentioned with the biohazards, you're going to need to go through the Board of Health or whatever agency is handling biohazards locally. And then the other piece to this to factor in when you're doing planning is the insurance and risk side, because whoever is going to be very interested in knowing the space that you're going into, but specifically what hazards you're going to be mitigating and how you're doing that in your facility. And then as an ongoing basis, there's going to be reporting requirements on the fire side specifically, but then also environmentally. You will need to do reporting to state environmental agency as well as EPA, whatever region you're in the US. And all of that, like we're saying here, has hidden costs. There are folks that need to be doing these things and watching these aspects on your staff. Those people need to have certain skills and training as well to be able to do their jobs and be able to report to the agencies accurately and on time. So those are just some of the things to consider. And I wanted to also mention that we're seeing another trend, which is office to laboratory conversions. There's a lot of office space available, as folks know, after COVID, with hybrid working and so on, and remote working. So we're seeing a lot of requests to evaluate existing buildings that originally were built as just office. They were not set up with MEP infrastructure to support laboratories. And even fire resistant construction is sometimes not up to par for what we would see or need for a lab building. We're often asked to look at the feasibility of putting in certain lab programs and certain science programs into an existing office building. And there are times where it's just going to be cost prohibitive to do that. I think as if you're a tenant looking at a building like that and potentially leasing space, there's a good set of questions to be asking. And I think top of the list is, what will you need to do as a tenant, and what costs, what investment would you need to make yourself into a building to be able to house the type of science that you're doing?
And John, so we get asked this all the time, what's the cost per asset to manage it? Or what's the ROI of a managed asset? In your world, is there a plug-in budget component? I know it's the equivalent. My wife and I are going to be traveling in Europe for 6 months. How much is it going to cost, this kind of thing? But is there a plug-in budget consideration if you have certain criteria, so square footage, the type of city or town that it is in, that can be shared with a client in order to, when they're looking at managing their assets and growth of that budget, is there a plug-in number? And if there is it done by square footage? Is it done by type of analysis or the type of lab that it is? Or is that just a totally crazy question?
No, it's definitely not a crazy question. All questions are excellent. I think of it in terms of people. And I would, in my experience, what I've seen that has worked and the thing is, it doesn't scale with lab size necessarily, because a lot of these issues are going to be present no matter what size lab you are.
Right.
But I would say that one full-time staff at a minimum to be watching all of these types of things, to be interacting with the local jurisdiction and all the agencies that you need to report to. Also, the relationship between, if you're a lab tenant, the relationship between yourselves and the landlord and how they're running and operating the facility, the overall building, and then managing your lease, basically. We're seeing lease language that is specific down to numbers of gallons of classes of chemicals that each tenant is allowed to have in their space, and how much square footage of a shared storage in the building they're allowed to have. So someone's got to be looking at all these things, not only managing the compliance end, but interacting, reporting, and then figuring out, like we're saying, what to do when the program expands. When you're seeing your business growing, what are you going to do next? What are the things that you need to do in advance of that growth and be ready for it from a facility standpoint? And then what I would say also works is, you have this full-time person doing all these things. It's important to have an understudy, someone who is learning all these things, preferably a little bit younger, so that you have a succession plan. There's always turnover that's going to happen, right? And so you want to have someone who at least has a pretty good working knowledge of all of these procedures.
Yeah, and just to
Great.
follow up with that, we keep hearing the same sort of thing again, where you're talking about it's the people that you find. And we all know people like Greg are unicorns. They're really hard to find. It's like that, exactly, the Jack or Jill of all the trades. The person knows all this stuff. And I often use this, you don't want to think about this. What if this person gets hit by a bus? What's your succession plan? And then, yeah, you maybe have an understudy, but you need to fill in that knowledge gap. And sometimes that's really what you're looking for. And these kind of people are really hard to find. And even the really good ones, sometimes they're missing little pieces of the puzzle. It might be on the engineering, plumbing side of things, or maybe it's on the instrumentation side, and they just need that little extra support. So with a lot of times these outsourced solutions, they've got more depth, and then that you're taken care of even if bad things happen.
Great. Thanks so much, Emily. This has been a great conversation so far. I think it was Greg who said in the beginning we could easily spend the hour on this topic alone. But just in the interest of getting to everybody's questions, I wanted to maybe move on to another topic, but we can certainly revisit this, or we could explore more articles with Lab Manager in the future. I just wanted to jump down to another question. If you look at number 6, this one says, what can we do if there are no after-sales services for our costly lab assets? Now, your thoughts on that, maybe?
That's a good Emily question.
Yeah. My company does a lot of this where they buy something and it has a certain purchase price of value, and then it comes time to get rid of it or move on, and it's just, they can't sell it and it's not worth what it was before. And sometimes I'm like, I could give you a bag of pucks for that, and that's pretty much all we're going to get on the market. And this is a tricky one. Sometimes when you invest in certain systems, they're not going to have a long lifetime value. And that's just the reality. Certain vendors may not have the reach into areas. Maybe they don't have the support services that they need. You can't get the parts to service them. And so the used market is going to be really poor for certain things. We always tell people it's like a time versus money thing. So if you have the time to just wait and try to find that magical buyer who wants exactly what you have, you'll get more money for it. But if you don't have the time to wait for that, then you're going to have to take the lower bid. So there are services out there for that where, there's companies like myself where we will sell people's equipment for them. And that's what we're always telling them is, if you can wait, we can probably find a better price for this. If you need to sell it right away, this is the value you're going to get.
In terms of the servicing of it, that's always, at least from our experience, that's always going to be a challenge. And the reason is that the technology changes, and it actually changes even the quicker now as time goes on. And it's also something inherent in how instruments are manufactured, how the manufacturers are designing their instrumentation. And I guess the question is, what can you do if there's no if there's no after sales service? In some cases, you just plumb out of luck, unfortunately. And this is one of the misnomers of value, and it is a hidden cost. So a company, in particular, a startup, will go and they'll scour the web and they'll find instrumentation, used instruments. And Emily, she was mentioning, on the auctions or from used dealers, they'll pick up the asset and think, geez, this is great. I saved 60, 70 cents on the dollar, only to find out that it's operating on an old Windows operating system, or parts aren't available, or as Emily said, there's vendors that don't have the reach or even are able to support something anymore. And you are stuck with, of course, Emily's example, a bag of pucks that's up north of the border, a north of the border analogy.
Sorry.
No.
But the Stanley Cup's on right now, you guys know, right?
That's right. Bruins are in the playoff.
Yeah.
At least for one more day.
Yeah. Sorry, I did misunderstand the question there. So thanks for filling that in, Ted.
Oh, sure, of course.
Yeah, I'll add one thing too, and it's somewhat related to this, and really related to what Ted was speaking to. I really use a lot of caution when looking at the used market. I think you have to be really careful. Like I was saying, it might seem, hey, we need a lyophilizer, and we found one for $60,000, less than the exact model, but it's only 2 years older. And just speaking to the hidden cost side of it, you think you're saving $60,000, but then you get it and there's there's a part missing that hasn't been manufactured in 2 years, or like Ted was saying, to the software, or even adding it on to a service. Even if a service contract is available, oftentimes, especially if it's one of the larger OEMs, they're going to charge an arm and a leg just to send somebody out and inspect that equipment and make sure that it's in proper operating care before they'll even let you sign on for a costly service contract too. So I think my one caveat is the used market can be great, especially if it's a situation where maybe it's a company in your building and you're very close with that operations person, and you can have a little bit of background about it. But just be really cautious when, especially if it's a piece of analytical equipment or a piece of equipment that historically has either hardware or software updates every 2 to 3 years. That's when you can really put yourself in a situation where it feels like you're saving money, and at the end of the day, it ends up being a really expensive paperweight. Just my 2 cents there.
And Greg, I think that there's another question that came up. What's the best way to forecast instrument retirement? That would speak to that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's also a combination of and this is where in my opinion, where the science plan and the operations, the science and the business plan have to be aligned, right? Oftentimes, and I've seen this from our experience, where there'll be a very expensive piece of equipment that is within 2 years is antiquated because a competitor comes out with something that has a lower detection level, or there's a regulation comes out that's going to require, and this happened in the cannabis industry, for example, where they had to have really lower levels of detection, and a technology that was only 2 years old couldn't get down to that level of detection. So it's a bit of voodoo that's involved. But it has to be an alignment of both the science plan and the business plan. What type of assays are you looking to be able to do in the lab, based on what clients are you going to be going after, or what your prospective clients are going to be requesting? So it's not a simple answer. There's a lot of things that are involved in that. And I would say there is where that's an advantage of bringing on someone or people that can look at that, at least ask the right questions of the team, the science team and the business team, to be able to make that determination. Because some of these, you spend $500,000, $750,000 on a piece of instrumentation that becomes defunct in 24 months, 36 months. That's a big investment.
Yeah. And like you said, Ted, a lot of it too is the experience of, if it's a more basic piece of equipment, if we're talking about a benchtop centrifuge or a freezer or a fridge or something, there's experience that comes with having an asset manager that does this for a living. They say, okay, we tend to see that our -80 ULT freezers tend to have a lifespan of 4 to 5 years before the compressors start wearing out, and you might have to look at it. So some of it is just going to be analytics and data that a company wouldn't have unless they're doing this full time, and unless they have that data set or experience. So I think for some of the more, I don't want to call it basic, but for some of the more basic equipment, you can have a better idea of, okay, this should last roughly X amount of years. But I think the hard part, like you were saying, Ted, especially when you start to get into either analytical equipment or equipment that just keeps evolving, that evolution process is happening so quickly. We see so frequently that we got the latest version of the software for a new piece of equipment, and 3 months later, all of a sudden, the computer that we're using to run it isn't adequate enough because it can't properly operate the next software upgrade, right, too. So I think that's a really tricky question, but I think some pieces can be a little bit easier to forecast as opposed to others where it's, like you said, Ted, sometimes it's unavoidable that a new technology or better technology is just going to replace something that you just bought, like an iPhone.
Emily, let me ask you a question, because this comes up often in the context of asset management, because vendors play a huge role in hidden costs of the program itself. So whether it's an OEM, or it's an independent, or it's internal people that are maintaining instrumentation, in your business, how do you make the determination who should you go with? Because oftentimes a lab operations person, if they're wearing the procurement hat, will have to determine, do I bring in an independent? Do I bring in a vendor? Do I do this internally, maybe for my tier 3 instrumentation? How do you go about advising clients in making those decisions?
And this is a very layered question, that's for sure. Yeah, there's a lot of factors depending on the size of the company you're dealing with and how many different vendors you might have at the site. We do often see this with a lot of the big pharma companies that we work with, is they do go to asset management to manage all these vendors. It's like Greg was saying, it can be a full-time job just checking in your vendors and walking them to the instrument and making sure they're there when they're supposed to be. That's a full-time job. Wouldn't it be great if they all showed up at the same time? It's like they're colluding to waste your time and money. And I'm not anti-vendor. I worked for them. So I was on the dark side. I wore Agilent underwear for a long time. I understand, I was that person. But yeah, it's a tough question because, and again, this also goes to the cost of, can your instrument be serviced? Is it in guaranteed support? Is it out of support with the vendor? So these are a lot of the questions that you might be looking at, and how to, if there's some of these companies, some of the vendors even will provide cross-lab service across different vendors. So sometimes that can be a solution that you might go to. Whenever we're advising our clients on how they choose anything, whether they're looking at quotes for an instrument versus quotes for service, it's all about, do they have the people to do the work for you? Are there the boots on the ground actually in the area that you need them? What's the turnaround time that they're going to be there, if it's for repair, service, for the qualifications, and cost, of course. It's a business evaluation on what you're going to be looking at there. They need to have the expertise to look after all the equipment. They have to have the access to the parts. Quite often, like when it comes to the high-end instrumentation, the vendors are very protective. So you might not, you go with a one source and they might not be able to service a thermo triple quad or something. That's the problem, because they want to keep that stuff in-house. So you may be stuck with dealing with multi-vendors, and then it may be more like, okay, management of the multi-vendors is what you need. And maybe you have the person on staff who can do that. You've got the Greg unicorn. So
you know, I found this to be interesting, but for those of us that have been around for a while, I can say that because I've got gray hair. I remember the sort of the evolution of asset management started with service aggregators. So this was basically, it was an administrative function, and it was using an actuary table, an insurance model. So basically what happened, when this was probably 20 years ago, companies like USCS and other aggregators, and it migrated from the healthcare industry, came in and said, look, we're going to reduce your service contract costs by basically starting off, all the contracts go away and we're going to do time and materials. And so the financial people said, oh, this is great. I'm going to take, if it's $1 million contract, knock off 150 or 15% off the top. The problem was, and you spoke to it, Emily, is, okay, now you have a situation where you may have a vendor now that's been disenfranchised from $1 million contract. And now you're going back to them and saying, we need you to go in on a time and materials basis, but we need you to do it in a hurry. So what's the motivation to doing that? That later evolved into the OEMs taking this on, the PerkinElmer One sources of the thermos, and they added the additional capabilities of bringing on their own engineers. But speaks to the point you just made. Now you're a PerkinElmer, and you're servicing a thermo instrument, which requires parts, which requires trained engineers, which requires software upgrades, which requires all of the infrastructure to maintain that instrument, where in some cases, even the OEMs are challenged in doing it. And you're asking a competitor to build a whole service company and infrastructure to service a competitor's parts. And by the way, the return on investment on a manufactured product versus a product that you're maintaining is totally different. There's a much higher margin on a manufactured project than there is on managing someone else's equipment. So this is part of the misnomer of oftentimes how certain of the larger concerns are going about asset management, in my opinion. But
yeah, just that I can add just quickly to that too. Once you do have one of those one source providers as well, maybe subtly or not so subtly, you do feel pressure to, when you're acquiring new lab equipment, to go through, that company because you have them on site and they're servicing your equipment and they're familiar and they're comfortable. And in my experience, once you have those, it's not saying that you're forced to get that company's product if there is an equivalent, but it certainly does take some of the selection process not out of your hands fully, but especially from the finance side, you tend to get stuck. And then when you're in a situation where maybe you decide to either go away from that provider or someone else, then it becomes even more complicated as well. So there's lots of little landmines you have to watch out for.
All right, great. Thanks, everybody. Maybe in the interest of time, let's move on to another question. Let's jump down to number 9. It says, what are the best practices for using analytics such as instrument failure rate, age, cost of ownership, and utilization to manage lab assets?
That's a great question. Emily, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I'm just thinking through the age, instrument failure rate. Yeah, it also ties into thinking about like when you retire instruments, there's a lot of kind of aspects to this, to managing, to like when I go into a lab and it's a small lab and I'm always asking them, what's the cost of losing the data that comes out of that instrument? And this goes right down to the method that they're running. So it's like managing the instrument all the way down to the method. So what happens if that computer breaks down, that instrument stops working and you can't get that data? What's the business risk for that? And in pharma, there can be even higher risks that are like not business based. It has to start at looking at what the process is that you're doing in there. So if you have one instrument and your business is revolved around the data that's coming out of that instrument, there's no redundancy. If I go in there, they've got multiple instruments running that. There's going to be a balance of the cost, what they're managing there. There's a bit of a bigger breadth that's going on there. I think that's getting to the answer to that question. Maybe it's just a little bit, there's too many nuance involved in all that. It's very detailed. I don't know, Greg, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you answered it. That's a great answer. I think these are the kind of nuanced questions that I ask myself. I think people on the operations side ask themselves on a daily basis, right? Because our jobs are really finding that balance of, we want to make sure that the equipment that we have is being managed and maintained properly, but we're also feeling the pressure, at least on especially smaller companies and startup companies, from that budget side too. I think the easy answer would be spend as much as possible, go for the highest service level, do this, but that's just not possible. It's not feasible. So I think when they talk about things like utilization and like Emily said, redundancy is important. If you have one workhorse piece of equipment and if that goes down, you guys aren't going to get data for days, weeks, months. Those are when you might want to opt towards going with that top level service that's going to give you a 48-hour turnaround time for getting someone on site to repair, versus maybe a piece of equipment that maybe you have two and they're redundant and can operate independently of each other, and it's not going to put you guys, at least from a lab work perspective, out for that period of time, right? So maybe in that situation, you do go for kind of more of a mid-tier service level. So those are things that I'm constantly thinking about. And I think in terms of analytics, it's certainly, with the way things are trending, there's more and more companies that are coming out that can give you some of that data in terms of usage and utilization and how hard the equipment's working and life cycle. And I think we're heading into a kind of a really exciting time period, to be honest, from an operations standpoint, where we're going to start getting some of the technology that I think other industries and other people have had for a while. And it's really just starting to bubble up or be passed down to us. So it's pretty exciting. But I think my short answer would be use all the data that you have, right? Use everything you have. How many do you have? How long have you had it for? Is it brand new? Was it bought used? I think use every piece of data that you have to make an informed decision. And if you're lucky enough to have some of these analytics or a good either CMMS or EAM, something like that can even help further track those, by all means, if you can do it. But again, it's always finding that balance between the appropriate service level, the appropriate level of work, and then how much it's going to cost.
And I'll also chime in here as well from a facilities standpoint. This whole topic that we're talking about in terms of business continuity cost, it's not only related to individual tenant spaces and how much you want to invest in things like standby power, but you need to look at how your lab and space is integrated with the overall facility, particularly in a multi-tenant situation. But things like, what are you utilizing for vacuum? Are you using house vacuum? How reliable is that? Is it good enough for your program? Or do you need also some local vacuum pumps, and you need space, you need utilities for those? Chilled water, you're relying on a overall building or facility chilled water system. Is that adequate? Or do you need local chilled water to augment that? These are all costs. And what happens, like we're saying, if you don't have a backup on the utility side and you lose a utility that's critical for operating your instruments, let's say those instruments might be operating like 24 or 30 hours straight, and you have an interruption. Do you have a system for notifying staff to respond and be able to come in and either fix something or turn something else on? And then the overall topic of what's the value of the research compared to how much investment you may need to put in to have resilience. From our experiences, the investments on the resilience side are often orders of magnitude lower than the value of the research, whether it's the material, the IP, both. So it's really important to look at things like, we do a lot of work in both the natural hazards as well as the man-made hazards, the chemical hazards. But on the natural side, are you in an area subject to flooding? Are you in an area that's, for whatever reason, subject to brownouts, different types of the year? How reliable is the electrical service coming into the facility? All of these things, I think, are important things to consider. Could be a little bit more an upfront cost, but what it's going to save you in the long run on saving your science, basically, it could be orders of magnitude difference.
So that speaks to the proper, in my view, proper profiling of the, not just the assets, but also, when we say MEP, so the mechanical, engineering, plumbing, and all of the umbilical assets required to drive the instrumentation or drive the plant, right? So from what I feel, that doing a proper profiling, and that's both, all of you have all spoken to this, right? So in order to do that, so you take it down from its basic level in terms of value. Is it something that should be replaced as opposed to something that should be maintained on a contract? And if it's a contract, is it a periodic maintenance versus a full service contract? If it's a full service contract, is it, to Emily's point, what's the asset? What's it being used for? Is it a dirty matrix? Does it have to be made? Do you need 2 PMs a year? And actually, it's specific to the, not only the class of instrument, but down to each instrument, because some instruments are redundant, some instruments are R&D, some instruments are mission critical. So it really is a proper profiling. And John, what you had said in terms of even on the plant side, and I want to go back to the question of analytics. I know from our experience, and Greg, if you're lucky enough to have a good CMMS system, or you have the technology that allows you to be able to determine what your downtime is and what your failure rates are, you can extrapolate from that. How do you do that on the plant side, Jonathan? I imagine there are technologies out there, and again, you have to look at redundancies as well, but I assume there are systems and technology out there that can help you make those determinations, and that the data drives those decisions.
Yeah, for sure. And companies will create databases of plant equipment that are so-called critical components for their business. And they'll prioritize certain systems in the facility and in their space and they'll develop not only preventive maintenance, but just a response plan. What happens if this system goes down? What do you do next? What's the backup? Who do you call to what we're all talking about here as well? For service, these things tend to fail at 2 a.m. on a Saturday night. And then all of a sudden you're getting a phone call if you're the facility manager, and you need to know what to do.
The stuff that you deal with, Jonathan, like us instrumentation people and the science side chemists, we're thinking about our instruments all the time. We're thinking about our methods, but like the infrastructure, the leasing, the HVAC, it's the backbone behind. So often, I'm talking about Greg being the unicorn, but those people in the lab who also like they understand the whole facility, that's so valuable. We've walked into so many places where we've been assisting these labs with that, like the craziest stuff can happen when those things go wrong. We worked in like a coroner's office where they did the HVAC wrong. Somebody opened the door and all the blood stuff came up out of the sinks, and they had to tear everything out again. Those kind of big hazards are preventable if you put the right pieces in place, right?
That's so true. And we're seeing it now in smart labs where there's remote monitoring that's being installed, and facility managers and operators are able to look real time on their laptop or other device remotely. And like I said, if it's off hours and they're not physically there, they can determine pretty quickly based on the data that's coming through what they need to do next.
I mean, it's all about expertise, really, right? And it's understanding where those hidden costs can lie. I've been doing this, like as I said, over 20 years, and things that could easily have been avoided, whether it could simply be that a certain instrument, NMR doesn't fit in the service elevator and it's being designed, and now they have to knock down walls, outer walls in order to get it up to the third floor, something as simple as that, or speccing out benches for a 20,000 foot lab, and the bench is not having the ability they don't have the weight tolerances for the instrumentation that's going on them, or you don't have room in the back for clearances for the umbilicals, for the electrical and for the plumbing lines. They're just very simple things that someone who has the expertise and has been doing this can look at something and immediately say, no, that's an issue. But
yeah, or as you and I have talked about over the last number of years, Ted, certain instruments require certain vibration thresholds. And you might be in a building where the baseline vibration threshold is 10 times higher than what your sensitive instrument can tolerate. And so all of a sudden, now you've got a cost of doing isolation for that piece of equipment, and that might have come out of nowhere for you.
And that's certainly a hidden cost, because you don't necessarily want to build a multi-million facility that is subject to the vibrations from a rail yard, for example, if that's the project we're speaking of.
Yep.
Yeah, I think what all of you have been saying, I really appreciate Jonathan bringing up the facility side. It's where I got dipped my toes in and started out. So I always have a soft spot in my heart for that. But I think one of the best pieces of advice I can give people is not only know what you don't know, right? Emily said that you might know a little bit about something, but might not be a subject matter expert on something. So know what you don't know and then plan for what you don't know. If you know that facilities up and down and you're an expert on X, Y, and Z, but you might not have as much of experience on the lab equipment side or that piece to it, right? Plan for that and know that when you're budgeting, maybe you don't need to bring on a vendor to help you do some of the preventative maintenance for some of the more mechanical vacuum pumps and compressed air systems. Maybe that's something you might be able to do yourself, or at least be able to manage yourself. And then for the things that you don't know, maybe that's where you plan on shifting a little bit more of the budget that you're working with to somebody like an outsourced vendor to help you with that type of equipment. I think especially when you're startups or small companies, I think you have to be flexible, but I think knowing what you don't know and planning for what you don't know is going to be the biggest difference between, like Jonathan was saying, between a vacuum pump going down and you not having a redundant system, or having a redundant system, or even having a good relationship with the vendor to be able to call them up and get them in there as soon as possible to keep downtime to a minimum.
There's another question that came up, if I can jump to number 11.
Absolutely, Ted. I'm gonna caution you that we're just about out of time here. I'm happy for us to address that last question, but I'm going to have to ask you all to give me kind of your elevator pitch take on this final question. I can read it out loud if you'd like,
Please.
And then you can all give me maybe like a very brief thoughts on it. It's been a great conversation so far, but unfortunately we've hit the hour. It says, every end user in our system wants the premier service plans for their specific instruments. How do we convince them that if we did that with every instrument for every user, we'd never be able to afford it? So again, give me your best elevator pitch on this question here.
I'll jump in very briefly. That's that speaks to the reason why one should profile the laboratory requirements. because if you have something that has redundancy, you may not need a full service contract on a second instrument. If you have instruments that are cheaper to replace, then that you don't necessarily need a contract or maintenance agreement on those specific assets.
Yep, I would second that too. It's about a risk analysis. Whatever the risk of your business is, you have to look at that, the risk of the instrument. Some instruments, like a turbo pump failure, you're look $20,000. Maybe that's the one that needs a service agreement on it. But something without complicated parts on it, you're good with just time and materials.
Yeah, but I would say tying it back to your business, looking at the value, I think related to what Emily and Ted are both saying. What is the value of a specific instrument connected to your business? Is this the critical item that's going to prevent you from, meeting your customers' needs, for example? So,
yeah, that's the best advice that take what those three just said and use it. Just the alignment between the operations side, the lab side, and the finance side is so important. And I think in my experience, I've had this exact conversation. I think just helping lab folks, and I think Emily alluded to this earlier, just helping lab folks understand more of the business side, more of the operations side, more of the budget side, while also taking everything else that they set into account, and hopefully giving them some perspective on why you're making that decision, and why you might go with a lower tier versus just saying we're not doing it. I think some transparency and some conversation and alignment goes a long way.
All right, great. Thanks, everybody. This has been a wonderful conversation. There's not enough time in the day to properly address all these topics, but you've given us some great information, and we're really grateful for it. Unfortunately, this does bring us to the end of our webinar. On behalf of Lab Manager, I'd like to thank Ted Palashis, Emily Kirkham, Jonathan Eisenberg, and Greg York for all the hard work they put into this presentation. And I'd like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us.